Morning, everyone. So I thought we would have a little discussion about Suella Braverman's deciding to pivot away from asylum and onto policing. Now, I will point out, particularly for those from outside of the UK, policing is very much devolved. There are certain... so really what we're talking about is Police England here. There's greater devolution in Scotland than Wales, for example, but by and large what we're talking about is policing in England, where Suella Braverman is concerned, because she's been in the papers today, well, today and yesterday, really, going, oh, police should investigate crimes, you know. And it's a bit like, well, this, first of all, this is a bit of a cheek, because I seem to remember, like, do people remember last year when the Met Police were supposed to be investigating crimes in Downing Street related to Partygate? And the Met Police said, oh, it's not our job to investigate crimes. And then they eventually agreed to investigate only when Sue Gray, who very shortly will be Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff, who handed over all the evidence she'd gathered. Then the police said, oh, that's marvellous. An amateur has gathered evidence for us because it's not our job to gather evidence. So now Suella Braverman, the same Home... Well, okay, actually, no, Priti Patel was Home Secretary at the time, but the same government who was running the police in England, including the Met last year, who said this was perfectly reasonable. Well, of course the police don't investigate crimes. I mean, for goodness sake, you watch too much television, my dear. Are now saying, well, they should investigate crimes. She's particularly trying to focus on thefts. But I want to have a little investigate. Now, there's lots of things you can look at in terms of the record on crime. You know, the so-called party of law and order. Shall we have a little look? So first of all, crime rates. Now, the government have been trying to say recently, oh, crime is well down when Labour were in power. Is it? Let's have a look then, shall we? So these are the actual crime rates. Now, the bits to look at are the red, England and Wales. Now, as I say, devolution varies a little bit. So in this particular case, crime rates are sort of England and Wales combined here. But what we can see is they've actually gone up. Now, what you can see the trend, I'll sort of point out the trend. From very early on in Labour's time in office, that's the graph starts, for those who can't quite read it, 2002 to 2003. I'm just going to make it a little bigger for myself as well, because it doesn't need to be that small. 2002 to 2003. And you can see, and Labour were in power then, they'd been in power for about 5 years. And it was falling, and it fell all the way through the rest of their time in power. And it still kept falling, even into 2011 to 2012. And it reached like a trough in 2013 to 2014. So it still carried on falling. Then crime rates started going up. Now, there's various ways you can look at this. Oh, Steve Kirk straight in there with a super chat, £10. Thank you very much. You can think of this a couple of ways. First of all, the Liberal Democrats amongst you will say, oh yes, but that was towards the end of the coalition years, and then it skyrocketed when the Tories were on their own. Okay, fair enough. We'll have a look at something else in a minute. But that is certainly one reading of it, because although it went up a little bit in 2014 to 2015, where it really started powering up was from 2015, 2016, right? So but nonetheless, crime rate went down. There was a big drop, and the Tories were doing this a lot. There was this huge drop in crime rate in 2020, 2021, right? And the Tories were going, oh, it hardly, Priti Patel's good, hardly loads less crime, aren't I marvellous? Well, why do we think the crime suddenly dropped in 2020 to 2021? Do we think it might be because, I wouldn't say quite martial law, but do you think it might be that for significant periods of that time, we weren't actually allowed on the streets? People weren't we were in lockdown, and we had several extensive lockdowns because the government always acted too late and had far too few mitigations in place. So we had more lockdowns than most, but we certainly had lengthier lockdowns, during which it's really tricky to commit crimes because, one, you're not allowed out. And secondly, even if you are allowed out, most people are in. So trying to burgle someone's house while they're on holiday or at work doesn't really work when they're at home. So that's why that dropped. But then straight back up again, straight back up since then. Now this goes up to 2022, 2023, because that's obviously the last year for which we have these data. So, and the Tories trying to claim, oh, the crime rate's lower than under Labour. And it's like, well, not really, because it's lower than when Labour were early on, but it is still high. And obviously this is just actual, this is per capita, by the way. So this is a decent graph. This is per capita. It's not raw figures. But if you look at when Labour left power, it's like way higher. And the way the Tories try and fill it says, oh yes, but we're not counting fraud. It's like, well, fraud's the single largest source of crime in this country. So of course you have to include it. But anyway, I'll read some comments before I go to the next instructive graph, because this is just where we are. This doesn't explain why we're here. I can explain with two further charts why we're in this mess. But yeah, people are sort of noting that, yeah, Graham, not very well. So I'm doing this solo, but that's fine. Christopher Bowles saying, notably New Labour were tough on crime, tough on the cause of crime. Austerity caused crime because the Tories didn't understand how youth services help parents removed by work. Also, oh yeah, all sorts of things in the mix. But it was, and yeah, that's what I mean. I said at the beginning, you could go into lots and lots of detail here in the data, but I'm just going to show it really clearly. But absolutely, indeed. In fact, this phrase, tough on crime, tough on the cause of crime, Labour are using again. It's in the language of the policies that went through the National Policy Forum this year, for which I still haven't seen extra details. But in the manifesto, because I've seen it crop up now and then, I wouldn't be surprised if in the manifesto we didn't see it again. Because certainly some of Labour, if I look at some of Labour's policies, they are the causes of crime issue. So what have we got? Putting youth workers in A&Es and custody suites to reach young people already involved in gangs, things like that. Prevention first approach, including access to mental health support workers in schools, providing mentors for children who are excluded or sent to pupil referral units. Like at the moment, when someone sort of goes off the rails a little bit, as we might say, they're just abandoned. Whereas Labour then and Labour now are recognising, well, what we ideally need to do, it's all right trying to get police to chase after criminals. Should we have fewer criminals? Do you think that will be in everyone's interest? It's all right saying, oh, the police should attend you if you're the victim of a theft. But should we try and prevent the theft in the first place? But anyway, on to the next one before we catch up with some more comments. So that is actual crime rates. So crime rates clearly up, and it's not just, you don't see the same pattern. You did see the same pattern throughout the UK, because while Labour were the Westminster government, crime fell in England and Wales, in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. Whereas when the Tories took over, it rose in England and Wales, not in Scotland, not in Northern Ireland, right? It's not hard to spot the common link, but that doesn't explain why. So let's have a look. First of all, police numbers. This is what happened. So police numbers, this isn't per capita, so I've put in some per capita figures. But the key points to look at, I would actually start with, early on in Labour's time, you saw this massive gradient upwards, police numbers, massive recruitment of police. That was Labour. Then it stayed stable, okay? Then you can see it crash, and this was immediate. This wasn't after the coalition years. This was immediate. This was austerity. Police numbers fell, and they continued to fall up until about 2019, at which point they have dramatically risen again. Now, this chart only goes up to 2022. It doesn't have, because, you know. However, the government announced in March the latest figures. So when I've put on the text below it, 2023 numbers, that is of March 2023. It may be it's less now, by the way, because police do keep leaving the service. But as of March 2023, which is the latest data I could easily find, it was 147,430. Now, the Tories will claim that this is higher than under Labour. But there are two problems with this claim. The first is what matters is per capita. How many police officers per million of the population? So as of those March figures, and it may have fallen since then, it won't have risen. As of those March figures, that represented 2,608 police officers per million of the population. This is in England, by the way. This is not the whole of the UK. This is specifically for England. In 2010, those numbers were 139,771, so it sounds like less, but per capita, that represented 2,655 per million. So in actual fact, the Tories are still a little behind where Labour were in terms of police officers. And they're well, because they haven't bothered reinstating all the police stations they closed. So your local, if you're in a sort of smallish place, your local police station, which may have existed in 2010, does not now, and still does not now. So that's the problem. The other problem with it is this. So per capita, it's still not as much, right? But it's still a huge boost on before. But here's the thing. Look at the police officers, because they recruited so rapidly, as Labour did to begin with, but then it stayed stable. So by the time we got to 2010, we then had a more experienced police force, because all of these sudden new recruits are inexperienced, right? Now, you have to have new recruits, of course. And if you've fallen badly behind in police numbers, you have to recruit quickly. That's understood. But they are nonetheless inexperienced. So you can't expect, even if you've got the numbers roughly the same as in 2010, and it's still per capita smaller, but roughly the same, you cannot expect it to be the same quality police force, because in 2010 it was a more experienced police force. Right? Dali Blazo said, good morning, Phil. Hope everyone's well. Everyone is well apart from Graham, I'm afraid. But he'd better still do his video later today. So that's the situation there. So police numbers just catastrophically fell as a result of austerity. Crime figures went up. They think they've now restored the number of police officers so the crime can fall. But it's like, well, no, it's not that simple. They're not that experienced. They need to be bedded in. The other thing as well, the only way the Tories were able to make that target earlier this year was by, Yvonne Cooper mentioned this in the House of Commons. They recruited people who failed the recruitment process initially. So that included, according to Yvette Cooper, who said this in Parliament, and she was not contradicted by the Home Secretary, or indeed the Minister for Policing, which it was Kit Malthouse. I'm not sure who it is now. Is it still Kit Malthouse? I forget. But it wasn't Suella Braverman, because she never dares face Yvette Cooper. But what she said is a lot of these recruits were people who had, well, basically criminal records, including like some were known to have addictions and some had criminal records. And it's like, you know, so they've recruited a load of people that under the old system couldn't be police officers. They basically failed, but then they called them back because we need the numbers. So we've recruited a load of people that are not just inexperienced, but some of them are deemed unsuitable by our own. We basically, Suella Braverman lowered the standards for police. And it's not like we consider that the standard, in fact, you would say because of certain high profile cases of police officers, particularly preying on women in the police force, particularly the Met, you would think we should be raising the standard for police officers. Yes, we needed to raise the numbers, but raise the standards as well. We need good quality police officers. More than that, we need honest, law-abiding police officers. You know, it's one thing to give people another chance. You know, if they've got a criminal past, you need to sort of go, okay, they need jobs, and to make sure that they don't fall back into criminal behaviour, should we say. But I think when it comes to the police, it's like, no, we should sort of expect that you have a history of being law-abiding, because the police are in a position to abuse their power if they are corrupt. So we have to be extra careful, don't we? Josh saying there, as a police officer told me, the experienced officers were encouraged us to take early retirement because computers were going to fill the gap, a loss of on-the-ground knowledge. Oh, yeah. Well, Suella Braverman can do that. She can send a computer to investigate these thefts, can't she? Get a drone to send an iPod there. That'll do it. Braverman is not only clearly out of her depth, but is also very immature with it. Add her obvious anger issues, we have a very toxic period. She is very, I mean, you know, on the money there. There's a lot of members of the cabinet that are incredibly immature, including Rishi Sunak himself. Yeah, but Suella Braverman, she pouts, doesn't she? She sulks. Like Priti Patel used to smirk all the time, didn't she? That used to wind me up. I don't know whether it did others. It wound me up. But, you know, Suella Braverman is very petulant. She really doesn't like being told that she's presiding over failure. But anyway, this is police numbers. Shall we have a look at another little chart, my last little chart, because this is also instructive. And it's police funding. Now, the chart here only goes up to 2022, 2023. We do have 2023 to 2024 budget, which I've put in the figures below. But I want to point out a few things. First of all, this is from 2009, 2010. The 2010 to 2011 was also Labour's budget, remember? It did go down a little, but as a share of GDP, did not. Remember, GDP was lower. Or actually, I haven't double-checked that. But nonetheless, what we saw was a drop in funding in actual terms. Obviously, each of these values is not taking inflation into account. It's based on the pound in that year. Now, I haven't taken inflation into account because when it comes to funding things like this, usually economists consider a better measure to be as a share of GDP. So, for example, it is understood that if you have a fall in GDP, like recessionary type situation, you are going to end up spending, your public spending is going to be less because your tax revenues are down, right? So that's understood. So a better thing rather than just doing it but you shouldn't just compare like for like. You can't compare 2010 to 11, 18.6 billion, 2022, 2023, 25 billion, because you've got to take something, you've got to have a standard measure. Now, the latest, actually, this year's budget is 17.2 billion. So last year's budget was 25.3 billion. This year is 17.2 billion. So already there has been, despite this increase in police numbers, there's been a catastrophic drop in police funding. This is for England again. I emphasise for England. Actually, this may be Wales as well. This may actually be England and Wales, I should be able to, I may have to say. But it's certainly not the whole of the UK is the point to make. And and this represents 0.7% of our GDP, our load. And remember, GDP is lower today than it was in 2010. I'm not even taking inflation into account. It's just lower. Our GDP has dropped since the Tories have been in power. And the funding in 2010 to 2011, which was Labour's last budget, 18.6 billion, which represented 1% of GDP. So the Tories have basically reduced police spending to 2/3 as a share of GDP, roughly 2/3 of what it was when Labour were last in power. We're saying I'd use percentage of income left after rent mortgages as the barometer of excess debt. Oh, sorry, we must be talking about something else. Must be a side little issue there. Perry's saying people don't report crime anymore. It's pointless. If you don't report, it's not recorded, it's still happening. That's a good point. If there are people who are deciding because the police won't do anything, they won't report it, then the crime figures, which I will put up again, because could in theory actually be higher. That is a good point. If people are more confident they'll be attended, then they're more likely to report them. That is an excellent point, yes. But yeah, I mean, this, to me, you know, these are the rates. This is the actual fact of the matter for which the government have to take account. What Braverman seems to be doing at the moment, it's almost like she's trying to blame police chiefs. It's, oh, you've got your priorities wrong. We've given you all these resources. You've got your priorities wrong. Stop messing about with woke causes. That's what she's saying. Go and investigate thefts. And it's like, so hang on a minute. So here's the situation, right? If there were just like a police force in England and you just happen to have a wrong and in charge of it, you could potentially, as Home Secretary, make the argument, you've got your priorities wrong, I want you to reevaluate them. Okay, you could do that. But that doesn't work here. because England doesn't have a police force. It has dozens of police forces, dozens of them. And they've all got their own separate... Now, if she's trying to say that all of these dozens of police forces, all with these dozens of chief constables, are all getting their priorities wrong, then she's saying that the system is fundamentally flawed. But it's the Tories system. It's the policing has been, the Tories have been in charge of policing since 2010 for 13 years. And by the time we get an election, it'll be 14 years. So, because it's like you can point to one person getting something wrong, but you can't point to a whole range of them. I'll tell you, there was you used to get the same thing in teaching. So, particularly in colleges, I noticed, because you could sometimes move around in colleges. So, you might get a different teacher halfway through the year type of thing, or. So, what would happen is a bad student will blame the teacher, of course, for the fact they're not learning. It could be true. You can't rule it out. But what they'll recognise is if they suddenly get a new teacher, all of a sudden they can't blame them as well, because it's then, if you're blaming two consecutive teachers, it's like, well, are you sure it's not you? So very often what you would find is if you were a teacher and you took over a class halfway through the year, you wouldn't get as much grief as at the start of the year from those students, because they sort of knew inherently that they can't just always blame the teacher if it's lots of different teachers. They know they can blame one. They know they can't blame all of them. And it's a similar thing here. You could, if you thought there was one police force failing, like I could point to the Met police are failing, and I can point to leadership there as clearly failing, right? But if you're going to try and say that all of the police forces in England are failing, and there's dozens of them, then it's like, well, you can't blame an individual here because there's dozens of chief constables, right? So you're actually blaming the system. So why don't you change the system? Why don't you make it more efficient? I think, I think Labour have something to do with that. Where was it? I can't remember what it is now. But I think Labour have pointed to the fact that there's a lot of inefficiency just because of I don't think they're necessarily, I don't know, I don't think they're necessarily going to combine police forces, although I would. But I think they're going to have more national structures, because at the moment it is incredibly inefficient. I don't actually know why we have so many police forces. There doesn't seem to be any sense in it. But anyway, the Tories not only don't do much to stop crime, they don't do anything to stop crime. Look, it's been going up. They seem to commit a disproportionate amount themselves. Yes. So, yeah, I mean, well, here's the thing, though. Crime rate, yes, inevitably goes up under the Tories, for which they are directly responsible. They don't really get counted in the crime figures, though, because, the police don't investigate them. And when they try and investigate them, as the National Crime Agency tried to investigate illegal behaviour, potentially criminal behaviour, with the Brexit referendum campaigns, Theresa May said, oh, there's some nice funding you've got there. It'd be a shame if anything were to happen to it, wouldn't it? And then all of a sudden they decided there was nothing to investigate. Richard's saying, whilst uniformed officer numbers are now just above 2010 numbers, total police staff, including civilian staff, still about 10,000 less than 2010, roughly 230,000 versus 240,000. Yeah, that's another good point. So a lot more paperwork needing to be done, or just not getting done these days. But there we go. Did Phil just ask the Tory party to replace the police with Serco? No, don't do that, for goodness sake. It'll be like Mad Max territory within like 2 weeks. You say the civilian staff are very good at the job they did, are probably more efficient than the uniform staff. They never. Well, this is the thing, though. You don't. If you're going to have well-trained, professional, and above all, well-paid staff to do a job, what you don't want them messing about with is lots of like menial jobs that you could give to someone with lower training and on lower pay, right? Again, I can give you another example from teaching, like my own experience. So the last school I worked at, which was a long time ago, because I've mostly been in colleges, but the last school I worked at, which was about 2010, interestingly, it was just after the Tories came to power. And I just worked there for a year. I was just it was just like a year's cover, basically. Not for like maternity or anything. It was the demographics was changing. Someone had left, but in about a year, the numbers were going to go down. So they needed to chop a teacher from the maths department. This was. But they needed someone for a year, so I did it for a year to go back into schools for a year. And I was being taken round and they were explaining things to me. So the way it used to be in a lot of schools, and it still is in some schools now, it's very inefficient, is you have what's called heads of year. So you have a teacher who is like the head of, and they deal with the pastoral side of like kids in that year, for which, of course, they get paid extra money, but don't do as much teaching, right? So these are teachers doing this. And what this head of maths said to me, their school had decided, well, this is just a waste. You know, you're basically paying a teacher more money to do less teaching and check ties and things like that, you know. So what they did is they employed people who were basically like similar to teaching assistants, but specifically purely for pastoral care, who didn't cost as much as a teacher, and it meant all their teachers were teaching. It's a similar sort of thing, you know. If you don't give like lower skilled tasks or tasks that need less training to someone else. The other thing is, as you note there, you know, like a clerical worker will be better than a police officer because it's what they're doing all day long. So if they're dealing with whatever paperwork or whatever you want to call it, systems, inputting data, they're doing it all day long. So they'll get really good at using the system. Like as a teacher, for example, we had to use systems. Sometimes we had to use systems very rarely. Like the systems you have to use every day, you learn to use them. But then there's a system you use every year. For example, when I did BTECs, when it was all coursework, every year you had to input the data on the system, and the system was terrible, by the way. And if you made a mistake, you couldn't correct it. You had to file a report to get someone else to correct it because you didn't have the authority to edit anything. So you could input data but not edit it. And it was a terrible system. And you only used it once a year. So every year it was like, bloody hell, how do I use this again? And then when it came to like recruitment time, there was another system to use if you were unfortunate enough to have to do that job of inputting people's qualifications. And again, it was a terrible system. And you only used it one or 2 days a year. So you forgot. The next year you forget. Whereas if you've got someone doing it all day, every day, they'll get really good at using the system. They will become more efficient. Yeah, so, you know, the reasons for failing policing is absolutely at the Tories' door. It's absolutely related to underfunding. And it's not going to be helped by the Home Secretary saying, go out and investigate crimes. Well, give us the police officers, give us the staff, give us the resources. They've got fewer officers per capita, and they've got less funding as a percentage of GDP. Hey, it's really this simple. You know, and like I said, and some of you have come up with it, you can look at a lot of things in detail. You can produce a weighty tome of detailed analysis of exactly where policing's gone wrong since 2010. But it can really easily be put down to this. Not as much funding, not as much staff. Simple. The Tories already have a Mad Max mindset. Do not grow addicted to clean water, or you'll come to resent its absence. You know. Brexiteers will want electronic solutions to policing, like they wanted for the Northern Ireland border problem. Yes, indeed. Yes. Maybe we'll get it one day. Well, what was that? Was it Minority Report or something? The Tom Cruise nonsense, where you were convicted for a crime you were probably going to commit in the future. Maybe that's their solution. Get AI. Just scan people in the streets. They look, you know, it's like the Victorian phrenology, isn't it? Oh, they've got criminal tendencies. Let's just lock them up, just to be on the safe side. I don't like the look of their forehead. Let's lock them up. That'll be a technological solution for them. Of course, then they'd have to expand the prison service. Can we just admit that we need intelligence tests for the selection of MPs? No, unfortunately not. First of all that will mean is that you end up with calculating evil. At least stupid evil eventually loses the elections. Calculating evil is more dangerous. So you just create a more intelligent Tory, which is not really in our interest. And the other thing is you can't, yeah. I know a lot of people will say, well, the obvious solution is to have MPs or ministers undergo some sort of testing to make sure they're at least vaguely sensible. But, you know, if you have universal suffrage, if you have the idea that everyone has a vote, then everyone should, if it's supposed to be, democracy is supposed to be for the people, by the people, isn't it? So that has to include everyone, including privately educated, childish half-wits. I nearly said something else then. But anyway, we've run out of time again, I'm afraid, talking about that. But thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a very good day. Don't forget to click the like button and to subscribe for the channel. And you can check out details for Patreon, should you be inclined, in the description below as well. Have a good day, and until next time, I'll see you later.